is Raluca, and as I was introduced, I do product management at Fitbit. Today we're going to talk a bit about software and hardware, but we're going to start with how did I end up on this stage. So basically, the idea is that I'm currently working at a company that almost triggers like a physical response when people hear the name. Because when you say Fitbit, people are either looking at their hand because they're used to having a watch, or they ask like, hey, you guys build a smartwatch, right? Yes, we do build hardware, but at the same time, we build software. So therefore, I had the opportunity with my team to launch Fitbit's first tracker for kids and a family accounting app feature. What am I doing nowadays? Nowadays, I'm mostly concentrating on software, and I'm running different experiments, or I'm working on shipping new features. So, speaking of software and hardware product management, even though at its core, product management is the same job, it can be quite different to ship different products, right? So, especially, I guess, in Bucharest, people are mostly used to shipping software. Hardware is quite rare. And I wanted to give you an overview of what this means in case you want to do that. But first, is there anyone from here working in product management? Okay, so we have 1 hand, 2 hands, 3 hands. Okay. Is anyone interested in working in product management? Okay, guys, that doesn't count. Wonderful. Where this is when I hope I'm going to be useful for you. So basically, I want to give you an overview of how these two compare, and then we're going to talk a bit on how they met. So first of all, we're talking about lean processes. Software is agile. You hear that all the time, right? Sprints, planning, grooming, retro, and so on. You have to be quick in this area, because if you're not quick enough, you're going to miss the market. But for hardware, things have a different timeline. You have to think about products that might ship in 12 months, in 15 months, or even 2 years. Therefore, you have to have a roadmap that expands across a very long time. What about the team? Well, for software, you can have a team with just 1 person. Well, I know that's not the correct definition of a team, but it could be 1 person or it could be 2 people and ship a product. When it comes to hardware, well, that's where the fun begins, right? You're going to have mechanical engineering, you're going to have the product manager, you're going to have someone that does firmware, possibly if you're doing a wearable, and then you're most probably going to have someone that does software, because you do want to have the mobile app experience that goes with it. And the timeline. As I was mentioning for software, agility is key, right? So everyone is expecting that your product gets updated at least on a weekly basis sometimes, right? You go on a forum and you hear, hey, I got this software update, but I would want my clock face to look, I don't know, like a unicorn. And I want it now. And then you have people voting. And then, your manager comes and is like, have you read the community forums? I want that, yeah, I want that right now. And you'll have to justify that sometimes that's not the priority, and that is part of your job. And we're going to touch upon that a bit later on. For the hardware, yeah, as I mentioned, it's definitely a longer process, and nobody expects you to ship hardware within a day. However, they do expect to ship prototypes quite quickly. Okay. So, going to the next slide, capital. To do software, you need a laptop and someone that has knowledge. To do hardware, well, that's where the fun part begins. Because if you ask someone, hey, I like to build X, they're going to say, well, we need a 3D printer, and then we need this and that, and so on. So it's definitely not as easy, and it's a higher investment. Probably when it comes to the cash itself, it's going to be a bit more expensive. And the scale. Building software, you might have a number of users that you have in mind, but at the same time, it scales dynamically with the number of users, right? If you have traction, and you're lucky, your product might one day reach millions of people. Whereas when it comes to hardware, you have a number of units you produced. And that is something that you do with the team from finance, with the forecast, and so on. Now, a very cool problem to have, to be fair, when it comes to hardware, is to run out of inventory. That still means, bad forecasting, and that is still something that you are constrained, but it's definitely something that you might enjoy more than having more inventory than you expected. And of course, we have other things that are different, but like the data source. For hardware, you have market research, you have customer interviews, and so on. While this software also gives you the opportunity to do experimentation and actually base what you want to change or do about the product on the data that you gather straight from them. And last but not least, and something that I'm going to talk a bit more, it's iteration. Iteration. Does everyone practice iteration in their lives? Right? You do something, then you're like analyzing what happened, look at the problem, try to understand what happened, and maybe try to improve. So it's a similar process when you build product software or hardware too. Why would you want to iterate? Well, basically because that removes the pain of shipping the wrong product. Because besides helping your company saving money, definitely helps you not to have unhappy customers. How does it start with? It starts with understanding the problem. It starts with validating the customer and brainstorming about what you want to do next. Iteration. Build it small and fast. You want to be very quickly. You want to make sure that your idea and your product is what users actually need, not necessarily want in a sense, right? Because you might have users that say, hey, I want that. But then when you get the product, it's not actually what they need. So test it out. Test it yourself. Give it to your friends. Bug everyone to test it and gather the feedback. And I think this is very important, to listen to the feedback and not skew the results, right? Because you might look at the metrics that you want to measure, and you might skew the answers to that. And last but not least, refine and repeat the initial product. So even though iteration at its base is the same process, it applies differently across software and hardware. For software, you have experimentation, and I'm going to talk a bit about that later on. And for hardware, you have fast prototyping. For software, you have the build, measure, learn cycle. It's a well-established process in software. You build something, you release it out there in the wilderness, you test it, you gather the feedback, and you work on it. And the cool part is that you might have a product that is not perfect, but you can improve that based on what you learn about your users, right? Because the way they use the product, it reveals something about their pattern and what they actually want and need. So, speaking about experimentation, I personally always ask, let's say if I'm in a new car, which has lots of buttons, or I once was in a cockpit and I was like, hey, what does that button do? Which, by the way, can be quite frightening for a pilot when you ask that. So I personally love to try things. And that's what experimentation can help you do. You can just move a button in the app, play with the color, change something, and it can be quite impressive how that changes the way the user interacts with your product. What about hardware? So we keep talking about software. It's easy, it's quickly, right? You just move the button, the second you deploy, and the second day it's happening. Well, hardware is a bit tougher. It's a bit difficult to improve a product after you shipped it, right? Like, it's on Amazon, the person buys it, and you're like, well, I'd like to take that back for the coming few days and reship it to you. It doesn't work like that. A user gets the product, looks at the experience of the box, and then is like, 1 star, I return this. It's not something what they actually want, or the product is not great. And if you have hardware that also has software, and you might have great software, the problem is that the user will not open it, right? Let's say, I don't know. Let's give an example. I work in wearables, so I'm going to give a random example about a watch. You buy a watch, the band doesn't fit you. Or the band is, I don't know, you order blue and it's green. The user is not going to go to the experience. Might have the best software in it, they're just going to return it. So we did mention that you can iterate on hardware. When does that happen? That happens in the first stages. You have nowadays, fortunately, quick ways of doing iteration. You have 3D printers, you have prototyping, you have makers labs, which make it easier for any startup to actually build hardware versus trying to have a huge capital and people investing into it. And in that sense, it's similar to what experimentation does for software, because it helps you gather user feedback and act upon. And I do want to emphasize something about that one. Sorry. Let's see. I think it's very important to show the product very early. So don't hide that. It can be such a small thing that can be changed and impact the whole experience. So don't be afraid, especially if you are a startup and you want to build some hardware. Just show it to everyone and see how they feel about it. And then you can take it back and improve and get back to them. Nobody's going to steal your idea. So I encourage that. And there is also, I guess, a fear of showing hardware sometimes. People feel that it's easier to show software. Don't do that. Trust me, it can be even worse if you're building the wrong hardware versus the wrong mobile app. So, a few key takeaways. Whenever you build a product, and I know everybody keeps saying that, I heard that at the other stage too, but always keep and put the user first. It's super important not to think of yourself as being the user, especially when you're in product management. And that's where all resources intervene. You have market research, you have interviews, you have well, at least in big companies, I know it's not the same for startups, you have a UXR department, which is UX research. They go and talk to people. They see how they interact with the product and gives you insights on how to improve it or change it. And even though you do have those departments, as a PM, you should always go and have user interviews yourself. So avoid just reading reports and being like, of course that's what happens. You should try that yourself. And as a funny joke, as I mentioned in the beginning, I worked on Fitbit's first tracker for kids. And trust me, it's pretty challenging, right? It's a public company. We have millions of users. And someone trusts you with that. And then you randomly meet the co-founder one day, and he asks you, oh, you're doing the kids project. Do you have any kids? And you're like, no, but I have market research. And besides the market research, I did go in user interviews. I did talk to people from my office, the random people in the airplane, and see how they interact, how their kids interact. I kind of started creeping at kids' mobile phones in the airplane. Nothing awkward with that, right? You're seeing someone, so what are you playing over there? That's interesting. And mom looking a bit freaked out of what's up with that person. But it was nonetheless super useful. What else? Always experiment. And you want to experiment because you don't want to make decisions without data. You might be lucky, you might, just listen to your gut and make the right decision, but it would be better to have data. And especially when you're working in a big company, data is your ultimate argument, because you're going to have to convince a lot of stakeholders about your decision. As a PM, you're not necessarily the most loved person in a team, because everybody wants something else. Customer support comes to you and tells you that they want something. Then engineering wants something else. Then design is like, that's definitely not the experience. And you're the person that helps with the decision. And the way for you to justify that to your team, to your manager, the CEO, is, hey, I have this data. And based on the data, I'm going to make this decision, and that's going to be the priority. So I've talked a bit about software, talked a bit about hardware. And what I've noticed is that the way forward is that when people buy hardware nowadays, things have changed. They expect for you to change the initial features. They expect you to be able to improve or adjust based on their asks. So therefore, life cycles have changed a bit. They do want new features. They want improvements all the time. and they want to be listened to, which I think is the most important thing. You are going to lose your customers if you're not able to adapt based on their behavior. And this is where this is not applying only to software anymore, it's applying to hardware as well. And I think it's very important if you build hardware to be able to anticipate that. Because there are lots of people that when they build hardware, they don't look at the future, at the fact that people want something else. So you should design for the future. You might want to have a battery which is a bit larger, for example. Does it really make sense for the current experience? You're like, why would we invest those 50 cents more for the battery? We don't need that. You don't need it now, but it might be that in a year, users are going to want an update to support something, and you're not going to be able to do that because your hardware constraints do not allow you to do so. So I would push very much towards that. Well, talked a bit about hardware, about software, about iteration. And I thought we should talk a bit about the time to market too. There is this saying, which I think you might be aware of, right? If you have launched the product when it's perfect, it's too late. That's what it actually says. And the idea is that we have to be fast in the market. But at the same time, when you ship MVPs, you want to have great MVPs. Because you want to have stuff that is still valuable for the user, and at the same time gives you the opportunity to learn something. So you don't want the user to be disappointed by the MVP, because they will turn their back on you. And they're not coming back. You have so many possibilities nowadays that if you disappoint them, that's it. It's like a broken relationship that never can get fixed. And keep in mind, if you do want to do product management, or you're tempted, leaving aside if it's hardware or software, and I personally encourage you to try them both. Hardware can be really fun. Software is definitely fun too. Yeah, personally I'm a bit skewed because I did both, and I kind of miss hardware a bit. It's fun. You have some tensions in hardware. You're like, a band is not good, a battery is too small, customer support calls you, you have everyone going nuts on things, and you can't fix it that easily. You have to mitigate from and working with a lot of departments versus software, when you might just mitigate that with the software engineer. But no matter what you choose to do, it's not about magical products ideas, in my point of view, to have something successful. It's about execution, and it's about being obsessed with that. And I know it sounds mainstream as well, but in my specific case, trust me, I've slept very little in those months, and I couldn't be more grateful for that because it was a super experience, and it worked. So I was lucky in that sense. Okay, so do you have any questions? So many questions. Okay, there's someone over there.
What? Can you say it? Thanks. So why do you think that people are still developing hardware, even though from your presentation most of us understood, or at least in my case I understood, that software is way easier to develop, to follow through, and find a team for that?
Well, software is, in my opinion, a bit easier to handle, but I wasn't saying people should stop building hardware. I mean, like, hardware is an important piece of our lives, I believe, right? I mean, you're gonna brush your teeth with software, for example, right? You need it. It's a must. I don't think we're in the point where we can live without hardware. We're gonna be anytime soon. But what I did meant is that when you build hardware, you'd better build it to have design that's going to last for years, and it's going to support software improvements on it.